Several years ago, I walked a handful of blocks up the street from my partner's house to a convenience store to buy something to drink. It was around 11 p.m. and I was trying to slide in there before the store closed. To set the scene, he lived in a transitory neighborhood that was chock full of abandoned houses and crime, with a few occupied residents and businesses scattered around. There were zero streetlights for illumination. Looking back, the nighttime excursion to the store from my place to his was absolutely idiotic on my part. But after living in that environment for years, you just became accustomed to it. Anyway, it was one of my many foolhardy nighttime store trips. My partner by then would ask me not to do it, but I just ignored that. I wanted my drink. So dumb of me. I got a few blocks up the street in the usual darkness, got my drink, and left the store to head back. Outside the store, a guy was standing near a trash can and hissing everyone who came out, asking for money, cigarettes, etc. I told him I don't have anything and started to cross the parking lot and head back, but this guy sprang after me like a freaking rabbit and grabbed a hold of my arm. He started aggressively demanding that I go to a party with him and trying to steer me down the pitch black side street just beside the convenience store. He was probably 6'7", crazy tall and super thin, with dreads all over his face, making it hard for me to see what he looked like. His fingers bit into my arm and it felt like it was pinching a nerve. My heart was pounding like crazy right now. I was used to brushing off this type of behavior, having lived in this neighborhood for several years by then. But this was way more aggressive than anything I've faced so far. I shook my arm out of his grasp, told him that I was heading to my boyfriend's place, and it was only a few blocks down the street, and that he was waiting for me. I said sorry in an attempt to placate him and took off speed walking down the street at top speed. He called after me several times, and then I heard quick footsteps as he decided to follow me down the street. By then, I could feel my heartbeat in my eyeballs. My mouth had gone cotton dry, and I was almost hyperventilating with fear, trying to stay quiet so this asshole wouldn't hear me. I had this feeling that if I showed fear or looked back at him, it would cause him to react violently right away, so I just put on a burst of speed and tried to outwalk him. However, my 5'5" legs were no match to his crazy long stride, and I could hear little pieces of rock and concrete crunching under his feet as he closed in on me. I literally felt like my heart was going to leap out of my chest and explode from fear. I tried walking even faster, but I could hear the guy right behind me. I could hear his breath in my ear as I got this overwhelming feeling that he was going to grab me any second, maybe with a weapon, and try to force me to walk wherever he wanted me to. The neighborhood is pitch black, so there's no real traffic, not at night. If he wanted to force me to go with him, I'd be powerless. Safe from trying to run from him, but with his height advantage, I knew he would catch up fast. Then I could finally see my boyfriend's driveway and him standing on the end of it, waiting for me. He had a terrible feeling and already worried constantly about me walking at night, so he went outside to wait for me. I saw that he had a crowbar in one of his hands, his usual defense weapon. He kept it near his front door. And then my nerve broke and I started sprinting towards him. The tall dude behind me started to run after me. I reached the place where my boyfriend stood and squeaked out, "Help!" or something like that. I dove behind him and cowered, waiting for the tall dude to pull a gun and shoot us both or start struggling with my boyfriend. It didn't happen. He gets right up in my boyfriend's face, standing way too close to him, and asked him for a light. My boyfriend gives him one, holding the crowbar aloft in the other hand, so that it was very visible. Then I grab a hold of him and yank him into the house, locking the door and absolutely losing it, sobbing and freaking out while trying to choke out what happened. My boyfriend goes looking from the window and sees him kind of standing around and then leaving. He saw him here and there for months afterwards, up at the store or walking down the street. Unsurprisingly, I'm sure, I never took another nighttime walk, and I still have nightmares about it. Several years ago, I was in the midst of an acrimonious divorce with my then husband. Full of crazy allegations and typical angry filings centered around custody of our child. As with many divorces, friends and professional colleagues seem to pick one side or the other. In my case, there was one sort of professional contact who reached out after hearing about the divorce, who offered to be a witness for my case because some of the experiences he related that I had been previously unaware of regarding my ex behavior out at networking events. After the initial call, he started calling me semi-regularly, just making sure I was okay. This wasn't someone I knew well prior to the separation, and he was much older than I was, but claimed to have experience with divorce and custody, so I figured it was a good idea to be polite and not alienate him since his testimony was important, per my lawyer. I kept things friendly, but I always had a weird feeling about him. After a few months, he called one day that my son was very sick, and when I told him I couldn't talk and explained why, he offered to run to the store for me, which I honestly appreciated. But after that, he was dropping by the house uninvited, or he would stop by with cookies for my son, etc. Again, I kept telling myself to keep things polite. The divorce was coming soon. Don't make this guy mad. He had called me out of the blue, and I was worried at that point that I was walking a very fine line, being polite, but clearly not interested. And if he got mad, he might decide to testify for my ex and say who knows what. During this time, he had also helped me set up my security cam my dad had mailed to me. And at one point, I needed someone to walk my dog, and he had offered to do it for me. He used and returned a spare key the same day. One evening, he showed up while I was painting and insisted sticking around to help. Just after that painting day, he came around uninvited and unannounced with magazine photos of decor and started carrying on in this manic way about how we needed to finish decorating the house. I was so weirded out that I made an excuse to leave. I started ignoring his calls and took my son and dog to stay with my parents for several weeks to avoid the drop-ins. I only came home for the custody exchanges. I came home a few weeks later, thinking he would have gotten the hint, and it was a quiet day. The following morning, I took my son out to the zoo, and we both came back hot and tired. I put my kiddo down for a nap in my bed, and decided to close my eyes with him. I woke up maybe an hour or so later, and it took me a moment to realize something was off. As I'm blinking off the sleep, I realized there was a rose bush sitting on the bedside table that I most definitely did not put there. There was a post-it note on it, something about planting in my yard. I started shaking immediately because I recognized the handwriting, and stood up and splashed some water in my face, and decided whether to call my parents or the police. I didn't want any trouble because of the divorce. As I stepped into my bathroom, I realized the mirror was covered in post-it notes, all with super creepy messages that were intended as love notes, but which all scared me. I was still waking up and trying to figure out how these notes could possibly have gotten there. My front door was definitely locked, but as soon as I went room for room, there were notes everywhere. I mean hundreds of post-it notes covering the walls, in my cabinets. There was even one inside my coffee maker. I started grabbing all of them and putting them into a pile when I got one from the kitchen that made my blood run cold. It said, "You're cute when you think no one is watching you." And I realized there was a security camera pointed right where the note was left, the one he had helped me set up months earlier, when I didn't think he was a psychopath. I called my parents in hysterics, sent a bunch of photos, and my dad insisted that I should not call the police, remember the custody battle, but that he would drive over, change the locks, and put a chain on the door. We also immediately changed the password on the security cameras, which had initially been installed to document if my ex tried to break into the house. So there's one on the front porch, but 3 inside the house, including my bedroom. This man was apparently hearing everything going on inside my house for months. The security cameras, I realized that he was just paying attention to my passwords when he was setting up the system, but the only way I figured he got into my house was that he must have made a copy of the key the day he had it, and because my dog had gotten to know him, he wouldn't have barked to warn me, which also scared me. I'm absolutely horrified. This man must have been in my house for a long time. There's no way he could have put that many notes up that quickly. and he was right next to my face and feet away from my son while we were sleeping, and somehow thought that was okay. I left and stayed with my parents for a few days, afraid of what he was going to do when he realized that he was now both physically and digitally locked out of my house. When I came home, my son had to go to his dad's for the night, and I was home alone. I was on the phone with another friend from out of town. About 10 p.m., the man showed up at my door, pounding on it, trying the locks, screaming obscenities, and demanding to be let into his house. Gone were all the niceties. This was someone completely furious and derailed. All I could do was hide in my bedroom until he left. It felt like hours. This was St. Patrick's Day, so I'm sure he had been drinking. After that, there were several other times that someone would start knocking at my door in the middle of the night, always when my son wasn't home. I think he was crazy, but not that crazy, and figured out if I called the police, he'd get in more trouble if my son was there, but he knew the schedule, so I know it was him. He tried reaching out using fake social media accounts several times, always getting blocked. Years later, I discovered he friended my mom on Facebook and was therefore still able to see photos of us that she posted or shared. And there was a huge argument when I saw a conversation they were having about me and how he could get back into my life. I sold that house 2 years later, still finding new notes as I was packing, and I'm more than relieved that he no longer knows where I live. I don't post pictures of my new house online, not the front anyway, and I've changed the privacy setting on all my social media accounts. I avoid all the places I used to go, the networking events he attends, and I stay under the radar as much as possible. I can never bring myself to play back the security camera video because I was traumatized enough and didn't want to see how much danger we could have been in. Hopefully he never sees this post, but you know who you are. I hope we never cross paths again. Okay, to start, at the time I was 19 years old. I'm a female. I was working an early morning job at Safeway. I would leave the house around 5:30 every morning. It was during the winter, so I would often wear a blanket to my car and sit in it for a while it warmed up. So one day my mom stopped by and parked in front of this man's apartment, which happened to overlook where my car is parked. He got super upset she wasn't in a spot, and that was the first time I ever noticed him. He looked about 70 and had a gray beard, was pretty tall and white as well. Anyways, she ended up moving her car and nothing else happened that day, but I think that's the day he noticed me and my roommate, who was also 19 and female. The two of us lived there, and though I've always been borderline paranoid, I always stayed aware of my surroundings. Soon after the encounter, I noticed when I would go to work, I had to pass near his apartment. His light would suddenly be on every morning at 5:30 a.m. when I would leave. I didn't think much of it and continued on, though I started to notice once I'd get into my car, he would be outside walking around and pass my car, which I definitely flagged as weird. This continued for a few weeks, but soon enough I noticed his lights would be on and his blinds would be all the way open. Very weird considering it was still dark, 5:30 a.m., and he didn't do this prior. Anyway, I stayed alert and started waking up my roommate when I left, just in case something weird happened. Side note, at this time, my roommate had a car that wouldn't lock. We didn't live in the best area, so she didn't keep any valuables in her car. Just random stuff, including a high school picture. One day, someone broke into her car and didn't do anything, but left her picture on the seat facing upwards. We always found that weird and didn't know who did it. Fast forward. One day, I was super paranoid at this point. I was convinced he was gonna approach me or do something weird. It was a gut feeling. I was walking to my car. I had my back faced towards his window in order to get to my car. I was talking to myself, saying nothing's gonna happen, you're safe, etc. Then my brain told me I needed to turn around. So I did. He was at his window, blinds wide open, staring at me. When he noticed that I turned around, he moved out of sight super fast. I got freaked out and got into my car and locked it. I then called my roommate to tell her what just happened and tried to leave as fast as possible, While I was getting situated, he was walking behind my car, and I was trying to stay calm. I ended up leaving, and I don't know where he went. After this encounter, I changed my shifts to afternoon due to safety, and me and my roommate decided to move. Never had anything happen since. Anyways, always creeped me out, and I wonder what would have happened if I kept working mornings or stayed in the apartment. This is not my story, it's my aunt's, but still scary as fuck. This all started in fall of 1998. I don't remember much as I was 8, but I do know what my aunt told me, and now that it's been so long, it's probably safe to tell. She and my now ex-uncle lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in a fairly nicer area of town. There's definitely some more crime-ridden areas not far away, but their complex was gated and you needed a code to get in. Anyway, around early October, quite a few people, including my aunt, started reporting seeing a suspicious man around the complex. He was caught looking in the windows of people's apartments and their cars, as well as storage areas. Management was able to confirm that he didn't live there. This all happened until around Halloween, when things really went off the rails. According to my uncle, he caught the man snooping around my aunt's car and decided to confront him. The man ran away. Again, this is hearsay from my uncle. When he ran, he dropped a bag that my uncle brought to their apartment. He wouldn't let my aunt open it and claimed he was going to turn it into the police, which we thought he had, as one day there was no longer a bag. Months go by and this man is still creeping around, but only near my aunt and uncle's apartment, cars, and storage area, but nowhere else. My aunt had called the police many times, and by the time they would show up, the man was always gone. It's now January 1999. Here's the part I remember as I was at my Nana's when it happened. My aunt called my grandpa in hysterics. She caught the man with his face pressed up against the glass of her bedroom window, watching her while my uncle was on a work trip. When he realized that he was caught, he tried to break open the window and get inside. My grandpa grabbed his .45 and headed out to the car, with my Nana and I following him all the way, begging him to let the cops handle it, and if he's gonna go anyways, to leave the gun at home. Well, he didn't. It took quite a few hours for my grandpa to finally return home. But when he did, this is what he told us. This man was in the apartment complex dealing drugs. My uncle stole his supply and refused to give it back to him or pay him for it. We later found this out because he was using it himself as well as selling it. So he was planning to kidnap my aunt, among other things, to get his money. I like to say that this thing made her divorce him, but unfortunately she stayed married to him for 10 more years after this. Last week, this man approached me on my way to work. I work in a big facility, so it's not strange that I didn't know him. He started by complimenting me, but in a way that made me feel really uncomfortable. He was telling me things like how I smelled good and I'm so beautiful, and he watches me all the time. He said he wishes he could see me more often and wants to get to know me, to which I replied that I have a boyfriend and I'm not interested. He laughed at me and said that my boyfriend doesn't have to know and that he wants to take me to dinner. He then asked for my number, followed me right to my car by this point. There was no one else around and I started to feel scared as I have some trauma centered around men and telling them no. I just wanted to get away, so I unfortunately gave him the number. I didn't give him a fake number because he handed me the phone and the call screen and had me type my number so he could call, and I was scared that he would test it. I had a panic attack in my car before I went home and hoped that that would be the end of it and that I would just block the number. All weekend he didn't text, but I got a call from the same number 3 times. I don't know if it was him as he didn't give me his number. When I walked into work this morning, he appeared out of nowhere and started talking to me like we had a secret relationship or something. I don't know how he found out what time I start because I've never seen him when I've come in before. I don't think I can report it to HR because I'm stupid and haven't been able to actually tell him that he's making me uncomfortable. I don't know if this will persist, but I'm scared leaving work alone now. I'm a 21-year-old female. One Saturday morning, I decided to go to my local Goodwill. I am disabled and suffer from chronic pain. I use a cane on my good days and a wheelchair on my bad days. Luckily for me, this was a good day. I parked out front and got out of my car and immediately noticed a man sitting in the far corner in front of the Goodwill. As I was walking into the Goodwill, he shouted, "Miss, do you have any extra time for me today?" I had never seen this man in my life and didn't really want to engage with him, so I politely said, "No sir, not today, I'm sorry," and continued walking. He shouted something else at me, but I couldn't make out what he said, and was afraid if I stopped and asked, then he would try to engage me in a conversation. I ignored him and continued walking. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him begin to stand up. I walked faster and entered the Goodwill. Thinking I was in the clear, I began walking around the front of the store, just looking at some items. My heart dropped when I glanced through the front window and saw him walking briskly towards the entrance. I immediately thought he might be following me. This happened to me before at Goodwills. Every time, I wound up in uncomfortable conversations where I had to continuously decline the advances of men that I was not really interested in. It's got to the point where I wear a fake ring when I go out so I can say that I'm married, because sometimes they accept that answer better than simply saying that I'm not interested. In that moment, the disability left my body because I picked up my cane and booked it to the nearby rack of ball gowns and hid behind them. Through the gaps, I observed him storming around the store and start to look through the aisles. I was scared because he looked angry, maybe because I ignored him. I didn't want to be rude, but I thought I made it clear in a polite way that I didn't want to speak to him. I don't think that's wrong of me to want to go thrifting without having to engage with random men. A kind woman nearby came up to the ball gowns where I was hiding and pretended to inspect them. She whispered, "Are you okay?" I said, "I think that man in the blue is looking for me." She said she thought so as well. I asked her if any of the nearby dressing rooms were open. She pointed to the one that was open, and when I saw the man with his back turned, I dove underneath the door and locked it behind me. I called my boyfriend from the dressing room in tears and asked him to come to the store. Soon I heard a knock on the door. The kind woman had gotten her manager. She told me that the man had looked through all the aisles. He walked out, grabbing his bag, and left the area. They closed the dressing room I was in and let me hide until my boyfriend arrived. Then, one of the male employees and my boyfriend walked me to my car. That was the end of it. Nothing really dramatic happened, and since we were in public, I don't think my life was in danger, but it was an unsettling experience. I hate to think of the possible confrontation we might have had if he had found me, and I'm just so thankful for the Goodwill employees and the kind woman who helped me out that day. So I live in a pretty sketchy area where there's a shit ton of homeless people. Some shootings have happened, and there's been times where people have gotten kidnapped. I can't deny I'm a pretty attractive girl. I'm 17 and around 5'4". I do appear a bit older to some people, especially because I have tattoos and whatnot. The point is, men tend to approach me a lot, especially older men. I'm sort of used to them staring and catcalling me, but I've never had anyone follow me before. On the weekend, I decided I wanted an Arizona iced tea and some snacks, so I asked my mom if I could walk to the liquor store. It's about a 5-minute walk, so it wasn't far at all, but there's a lot of homeless people and prostitutes who just hang around the path, so obviously you're going to be a bit on edge. I have 3 sharp knives that I always carry on me just in case anything happens whenever I'm out. Nothing usually happens. I've walked to the store a handful of times, so I was pretty comfortable, especially since I had my pocket knives. I got onto the sidewalk and made eye contact with 2 men who were kind of eyeing me. It threw me off immediately, but I just kept walking. The parking lot was kind of full, so I felt kind of relieved. I eventually got inside and got my snacks, and I noticed one of the guys had come into the store right after I entered. I didn't notice this until I realized he was following me through the aisles, and I instantly felt my heart drop. I seen him hovering over items as if he was looking at them, but he just didn't want to come off as suspicious to anyone. Since there's 5 other people in there, I get in line and he's right behind me. At this point, I'm shaking and my mind is racing. I paid for my snacks and I started walking towards the door, but my gut knew something was wrong, like really, really wrong. I'm very intuitive and sensitive to energy, so I felt this times 1000. I instantly turned last minute and started looking at gift cards right by the door while the guy walked outside, so I assumed he left. I called my mom and explained what happened, and she came to pick me up in her car. She got there, and I walked outside, but I didn't realize the dude was waiting there for me. He purposely stood on the left side of the door so I couldn't see him anymore. I got in the car and my heart dropped when I noticed the whole parking lot was empty, and there were the 2 men waiting for me. He walked up to his friend and started saying something in his ear, and then they both just stared at me for a while we drove off. This shit scared me to my core. It's happened to me a couple more times, but this was the only time that there were 2 people instead of 1. This happened a few years ago. My friend, 19 female, and I, 18 female, were at our local convenience store. We both had guys we were seeing at the time, and we both needed condoms, so we bought 2 boxes and paid together. The cashier was normal, but the guy behind us kind of smiled and laughed at us. He was probably about 30. We left and didn't think anything of it. We got in my car and I drove a town over, about a 10-mile drive. We used to drive around aimlessly for something to do, listen to music, you know. We got to this next town and pulled up to a red light. Suddenly we realized that the guy next to us was trying to get our attention. I rolled my window down. It was the guy that had been behind us at the store. He said something like, "What, I'm not invited to the party?" and laughed. My friend and I looked at each other and were basically like, what the fuck? We drove away as soon as the light changed. That was the end of it. It was a long way to go to make a bad joke and make some teen girls feel uncomfortable. So I'll admit, this is pretty mild compared to other stories here, but it was creepy enough to make me nervous. I was walking to work this morning, and I passed by a park where a few homeless people tend to congregate. As I'm walking, I hear, "Hey." I glance over to my right, and there's 2 guys sitting on the picnic table, maybe 50 feet away, and a few other people milling around a little further away. I wasn't sure who the hey was directed towards, so I kept walking. Then I hear, "Hey shorty." I ignore it. Then it was, "Hey shorty, come here." I called back, "I gotta go to work," an excuse that happened to be true. I didn't think much of it until I got a block past the park when I heard faint voices behind me. I looked, and 2 guys were walking behind me. I assumed the same 2 guys since there's no one behind me previously. It didn't seem like they were trying to catch up with me, but I picked up the pace and crossed the street to a gas station. I wandered a bit through the store and picked up a few things for lunch, then went in a line to go pay. Just then, the 2 disheveled guys walked through the door, saw me, and they were eyeballing me so hard and kind of whispering to each other. This is when the nerves really started screaming, because I immediately knew that these were the guys from the park, and they were both big guys. Not fat, but very tall and husky. I'm 5'2", and they were easily 6'2" or 6'3". I check out and went over to the door on my phone, acting like I was waiting for a ride or something. But really, I was watching them and waiting for an opportunity to leave safely. I kinda half-heartedly browse around, not actually picking anything up, and the second they were out of sight, behind a shelf, I booked it out of the store. I immediately got out of sight of the store windows, weaved between a few buildings, and crossed a couple streets, so I was a few blocks away pretty quickly. This way, they wouldn't be able to look down the main street to see where I had gone. I was about a half a mile before I got to work, and I made it without incident. Could have been nothing. They might have been planning to go to the gas station anyway. but my gut is telling me otherwise. I think I was somewhere between 10 and 12 when this happened, but I remember it pretty well. I was a very adventurous kid, still am now. I was always outside, wasn't at the house too much, especially around this time as my parents were going through a divorce and everything was about them, and as children were somewhat neglected. We lived in a really nice little suburban neighborhood that had a lot of trees and curvy, hilly, windy blocks that was quite a lot of square mileage. Basically, we had a lot of space to explore. I was with 4 friends during the summer. It was the middle of the day, and we were walking back to someone's house after playing baseball or something. 2 of us had scooters and went ahead a little ways, with the other 2 trailing behind, walking. At one point, our scooter friend gets to the end of the block and turns around to wait for the slowpokes, just walking. And I remember getting a strange feeling, but at the time, I didn't really know up from down, so I barely recognized it. They're both looking back at us kinda concerned, which I think triggered that feeling. One of them shouts, "Guys, run!" I look at my friend like, why would they want us to run right now? He says it again with more force, and gave me a sight fright. Run! Alright, we start running full speed towards them. Really wasn't that far away, maybe 100 feet, and stopped when we got to them. Why did you tell us to run? A car drove by us slower than normal with purple tinted windows and turned around the corner and disappeared. Apparently the car had slowed down and was pulling over. Someone had opened the door, and it seemed to my friends that they were getting ready to grab us. I don't remember seeing that part happen, but I do remember a very eerie vibe of the car, so I'm fairly certain it did. I thought I remembered the same car parked in a nearby driveway, like it lived there, and it was there a lot, but I was never sure if it was that exact car or not. Anyways, there's my creepy story. So this happened almost 20 years ago when I was a young 15-year-old girl. I had an older neighbor who taught the drums and was friendly with my family. I would take drum lessons from him once a week. He only lived like a half block down, so I'd always walk, and his family lived at the end of the cul-de-sac. Well, one summery day when I was walking home, at like 4 p.m., broad daylight in a quiet neighborhood, there was a strange man standing across the end of the cul-de-sac. He had on a big cowboy hat, odd for the area, and some facial hair. I don't know. He was maybe in his 30s, and he was just staring at me. He was watching me as I walked down the cul-de-sac and crossed the street, and once my back was to him, I could hear him following me. My heart sped up. My drumsticks seemed like weak protection, and I was wearing thin little flip-flops. I remember thinking if I had to kick him, they weren't going to help me at all. Less than a half block away from me was a more busy street, and I remember thinking if I could just get to that street where people would see, he'd be sure to back off. But his steps sounded closer, and I could taste the panic knowing I wasn't going to make it. I ended up running to a house where I kind of knew the family, and I knew the mom with young kids was probably there. I pounded on her door, tried to open it myself in panic. She opened it, and I spilled into her house and locked the door, told her what was happening, and let my heart calm down a bit. After being in her house for 15 minutes, I asked if I could hop her back fence to go home, since it would cut a block out of travel. But when we slid back the drapes of her back door, the dude was leaning up against the fence, right against her house, where you could see both the front door and the back door. She ended up loading her kids into the car and driving me home, and later had her husband ask around. Turned out the dude was living with his mother and had just gotten out of jail. Not sure what the charges were. All I know was my stomach had been twisted into knots, and it's the first time I tasted fear like that. I don't know what would have happened if he caught up to me. I'm scared and trying to calm down by writing this. At 6:30 this morning, I went to walk one of my dogs. I live in an apartment that resembles a townhome, and I live on the ground floor. As I'm walking my dog, I pass by a row of cars, and all of a sudden my dog stops and starts huffing and puffing at this one truck. No one was in the truck, so I thought it must have been a squirrel underneath it or something. When all of a sudden my dog's attention changes and there's a man that pops up from underneath or behind the truck. I couldn't tell. I immediately turn around and start speed walking back to my apartment. I wasn't wanting to overreact because hey, it might be his truck and maybe he's doing something to it. But then my dog keeps huffing and puffing behind me, and when I turn around, I can see the man clenching something in his right hand and barreling towards me. I immediately take off in a sprint towards my apartment and make it back safely. I immediately woke up my boyfriend, and within the 30 seconds it took him to go outside, the guy was gone. I'm a 23-year-old female, and when this happened I was 21 and with 3 of my best friends. It was supposed to be a fun trip with friends, a chance to explore new places, take in the scenery, and make some great memories. But as we drove through a remote stretch of highway, I couldn't shake this feeling that we were being followed. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but as we continued down the road, the same car stayed behind us, always at a distance, never passing us. It was a dark sedan with tinted windows, and I couldn't make out the driver or any passengers. I tried to stay calm and reassure myself that it was just a coincidence, but my nerves were on edge. We eventually stopped for gas and snacks, and as we pulled back onto the road, the car was still behind us. Now I knew something was up. I mentioned it to my friends, but they brushed it off and said I was just being paranoid. As the miles passed, I grew more and more convinced that we were in danger. The car was still behind us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was inside was watching us, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Finally, I had the chance to take some action. I pulled off the road into this crowded parking lot, hoping the other car would just drive past. But my fears came true as it pulled in behind us. I knew we had to do something quickly, so I raced through the parking lot, probably going faster than I should, and quickly turned the car around and headed back up the way we came. The other car followed us for a while, but eventually turned off to the side of the road and disappeared from sight. We were all shaken by this experience and ended up taking a different route to our destination. I don't know what the other car's intentions were, but I'm grateful that we were able to avoid any kind of confrontation. From now on, I'll be much more careful about who's following us on the road. I'm an 18-year-old female. It was a beautiful day outside and I decided to take a walk to the park to clear my head. As I walked down the trail, I noticed someone else was on the path behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another person enjoying the park. But as I continued to walk, I realized that the same person was still behind me and didn't appear to be stopping or changing direction. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling and continued my walk, but the persons present continued to make me feel uncomfortable. I turned the corner and waited for a moment to see if they would continue to follow me, and sure enough, they did. As I walked faster, so did the other person. I could hear the footsteps getting closer and closer, and my heart started to race. I don't know what I was thinking, but I decided to turn around and confront them. But as soon as I did, they turned and ran away. I felt relieved that the person had left me alone, but also frightened by the experience. I wondered if they had been following me for malicious intent, or if it was just a strange coincidence. I quickly made my way back home, making sure to look over my shoulder frequently. This experience left me feeling uneasy and aware of my surroundings whenever I went for a walk alone. I made a mental note to be more aware of my surroundings and to always trust my instincts when it comes to my personal safety. I was in the mall shopping for some new clothes when I noticed a man following me from store to store. At first, I thought he might just be browsing the same stores that I was, but as I made my way through the mall, I could tell that he was getting closer and closer. I tried to lose him by turning into different aisles and going to different stores, but he always seemed to be a few steps behind me. I started to feel uneasy and my heart began to race as I realized I was being followed. Every time I would turn around, he would dart off to a different area in the opposite direction, making me even more suspicious. I immediately went to mall security and explained the situation to them. They took me seriously and sprung into action. They patrolled the mall trying to find the man who had been following me. After a few hours, I was contacted and they identified the man and detained him for questioning. It turns out that he had been following me for quite a while and had a history of stalking and harassment. I was so grateful that the mall security took me serious and were quick to respond. This experience has left me shaken, but I know I had done the right thing by speaking up and seeking help. I have not been back to the mall since.